Okay, it always seems that the bad guys get the most attention. So we're going to have a full session on, I'm going to try to cover as much ground as I can. Again, it's still a bird's eye view of divine rebellions. And yes, the S on the end of the word is intentional. I like to start this session this way. If you asked the average Christian, why is the world so wicked? Why is humanity so depraved? Why is the world the mess that it is? Okay. The answer you're going to invariably get is the fall. Okay? The fall. The fall gets blamed for everything. If you asked an Israelite or a first century Jew the same question, hey, why is the world so wicked? Why is the world such a mess? Why do we have this chaos and suffering and so on and so forth, sin? That is not the answer you would get. The Israelite and the first century Jew would not just say, well, it's the fall, Genesis 3. The answer you would get is, well, there's actually three reasons why the world is the way it is. The first one is the fall. They would acknowledge that. The fall is the entrance of rebellion into God's good world, both on a supernatural level, because we have a supernatural being that decides to interfere and impede with what God wants for humanity in Genesis. But there are also two other rebellions. There are two other reasons why the world is the way it is. And these other two reasons, you have a rebellion in Genesis 6, 1 through 4, with the sons of God, and you have what happens at Babel. Unfortunately, and I'm going to say a little bit as to why this is in a moment. But again, it's been my experience that the second one of these, the Sons of God episode, is regularly either ignored in the church or demythologized. It's explained away as something other than a supernatural rebellion. So you never get this part of the Israelite Jewish worldview. The Genesis 6 episode is a huge deal in intertestamental literature, which bleeds into the New Testament because the New Testament writers are part of what we call the Second Temple period. You get the temple rebuilt after the return from exile, all the way into 70 AD when it's destroyed again. That period, the New Testament is part of that. What happens in Genesis 6 is a really, really big deal in their view of depravity that overspreads the earth. So if we sort of don't have that one count, if we sort of remove that from the picture, we miss some significant elements to not only understand certain things in the New Testament, but also certain things in the Old. The third one, Babel, this is a Sunday school story that everybody knows. I didn't run into Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 until I was a doctoral student, as far as what in the world is going on there. And part of the reason is because our modern English translations do not utilize the Dead Sea Scrolls in those verses, and in other verses in Deuteronomy 32 as well. So we never see what the text originally had there and why it's important, because Paul and others dip into Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 with a fair amount of regularity. And that passage is the foundation for what we today loosely call spiritual warfare. But you'll never see it unless, again, you have like the Dead Sea Scrolls to help you. You'll never see it. Even though Paul alludes to it in Acts 17, you'll just never see it. It'll look like what Paul's saying has no context for it, like he's just making something up, because I can't find that in the Old Testament. Again, it's a textual issue. It's a manuscript issue. But all three of these, again, would be the Israelite Jewish explanation for why the world is the mess that it is. And as far as what, again, pun intended, I'm so clever, the fallout of the three rebellions, the three falls, if you will. The first one, what that incurs to humanity is estrangement from God and death. Romans 5:12, wherefore so by one man sin entered the world and death by sin, so that death passed upon all men. By the way, it doesn't say guilt there. It says death. Death passed upon all men. So we have an estrangement from God and we have a death problem. The second one is viewed, again, by Second Temple period Jews as a root cause of the proliferation of depravity. It's not that humans aren't depraved because they fell in Genesis 3. These were willful acts of rebellion. And you have plenty of other willful acts of sin that ensue from it. But Genesis 6 was thought to be about the proliferation, the acceleration of depravity among human beings. And in the Old Testament period, it was a lethal threat that arose from this event to the people of God as the people of God were known then, the Israelites. And the third one is really about abandonment and fragmentation of God, and not only God to the rest of humanity besides Israel, but really all of the nations from each other, and especially to God. Now, if you were a Second Temple period Jew, and your answer to why the world is the mess that it is, were these three things, you expect the Messiah to cure all three problems, not just one. You expect the Messiah to not just fix Genesis 3, but to fix the others. And that is actually what you get in the New Testament. It's just that we're sort of blind to the other two. So I want to talk a little bit about each of these. Again, if you're one of my people, if you're an academic and love books with footnotes, Unseen Realm has an awful lot of data. I have a whole book that's going to be, the title's going to be Demons, but it's not going to be out for a while. I've already turned it in. Who knows what the publisher's going to do there? They'll do something. But that's going to have a truckload of data in it as well. And so those are the two sources. But Unseen Realm is out, and you can get more detail if you want it. Now, what I want to say about the first rebellion is that if I asked you, hey, you know that story in Genesis 3 about the serpent? Who was the serpent? Like every Christian's going to say, well, that was Satan. It was the devil. In other words, the serpent there was more than a snake. Now, every Christian that I've ever met affirms that idea. But you'd be amazed at how much resistance there is in the academy to reading Genesis 3 that way. Again, I'm not going to go into why that is, but if you're going to check up on Mike after today's meeting, a lot of scholars don't agree with that. I'm telling you that already. I already know. And their reasons for doing so are things I address in books and take apart their answer and show why it's not really a good answer. But the New Testament is one. We're dealing with more than a snake. In other words, Genesis 3 is not teaching us a zoology lesson. It's not teaching us a lesson about the evolution of snakes. You'll read that in creationist literature. The serpent originally had legs and cursed to the ground. And no, look, it's not teaching us about some development of a creature. It's not about zoology. It's not about biology. Again, we could go into all sorts of imagery about this being, and I could show you all sorts of data about how both in Mesopotamia and Egypt, supernatural throne guardians, they guarded the presence of the deity, were cast as serpents or dragons, because those are dangerous. Okay, like if I was writing a story now and providing illustrations, and I wanted to talk about bodyguards, I wouldn't put like a bunch of guys that weigh like they look like they're teenagers and they're not muscular. I mean, you're going to draw those individuals as bad-looking dudes, because we just have this association with bodyguards and security, especially around kings and whatnot. They're armed to the teeth. They're a threat. If you step out of line, you're going to pay the price. This is the standard way, or one of the standard ways, of describing a throne guardian in the ancient world. So what we have here is we have an individual, an entity, and you can read Ezekiel 28, Isaiah 14, that has close proximity to God. But in Isaiah 14, this individual decides, Isaiah 14, 12 through 15, I want to be like the Most High. I will be the Most High. I want to be the one in charge of this. I don't like God's decision to make humans part of our family. Okay, I want to be the ruler of the council. You'll get language like this in these passages, where Eden is the cosmic mountain, the place where God dwells. Again, portrayed as a mountain because it's remote and transcendent. You have this individual rebelling and being cast out, cast away, but not before enticing humanity to rebel. So we have rebellion in the supernatural world and the human world. Revelation 12 and 20, this individual is identified as the serpent or the devil, the original rebel, who becomes sort of God's original adversary. And the cost of his rebellion is death to humanity and estrangement, separation from God. But the heart of the story is a supernatural rebellion. It's not a lesson about snakes and about biology and zoology. Now, this chart here is hard to read. It's from Unseen Realm. But all I want you to notice is the right-hand column. I have red, green, and yellow. Those are places where Genesis 3, Isaiah 14, and Ezekiel 28 overlap. It's a good number of places. On the left-hand side, you have Hebrew terms for the dwelling place of God. Again, Eden is more than a garden. The serpent is more than a snake. These are images designed to convey the dwelling place of God. God actually came to earth. He created people to be in there, on the earth with him, with his supernatural family. One of them was a rebel and brings death because Adam and Eve are driven out of the garden, driven away from the presence of God, away from the tree of life, the two things which gave them contingent immortality, that is lost. It's not just a story about snakes and people in a garden. There's transcendent imagery here that takes us into the supernatural thought processes. What it really, is trying to get at is chaos, disruption, disorder began in this place. It began in God's home. And the result was humanity now is going to live in a broken world. They're the product of a broken home. It's not what God wants it to be. Scholars use words like chaos to describe every condition or set of conditions that is contrary to the way God wants things. And this is where it begins. It's a disruption in the way God wants things. The serpent figure is cast down. Okay, in all three accounts, Genesis 3, Ezekiel 28, Isaiah 14, cast out of the presence of God to the earth. Now the earth, interestingly enough, one of the Hebrew words for earth is eretz. It's the same word, or one of the same words that can be used to describe the realm of the dead, the underworld, the bad side of the spiritual world. The serpent figure becomes Lord of the dead in Israelite thinking. Why? Because from this moment on, everything dies. The earth is not what it should be. It's cursed because of what happens here. It's going to decay and corrupt and be the contrary, the opposite of what God wants it to be. It's death. If you like Stranger Things, think of the upside down. Okay? It's a place of decay. The very air is like a contagion. It's pathogenic. All these things. It's death personified. And its Lord, its keeper, becomes known in Scripture and in other texts, even texts that aren't in the Bible, as Lord of the dead. He owns humanity. He owns their destiny from this point on, because separated from God, they will die, and they'll stay dead. So the Messiah is supposed to fix this. The realm of death you could think of also as decreation. Think of the reverse of what happens in Eden. In Eden, God brings life. He creates. He brings it into being. It's in perfect harmony with him. As a result of Genesis 3, all of that is reversed. Everything is the opposite. This is why, later on in the Bible, inhospitable and uninhabitable places will be described with underworld terminology, like Sheol, the grave. The wilderness is uninhabitable. The wilderness is where the demonic lives, because if you go out there, you'll die. It's the realm of the dead. Again, all these things are metaphorical to convey a certain idea about the way God wants life to be and the way it unfortunately is in our world. You read through the Old Testament. I have a few examples here. If you read Isaiah 13, this is why you get desert creatures. The writer uses the vocabulary of desert creatures to describe demonic beings. It's not that owls and hyenas are demonic beings. It's that they eat dead things. They're unclean. They are death personified in some way. And where they live is where things go to die. Everything that's threatening, everything that's in decay, everything that's dead is the anti-Eden. It's the other side. Again, Stranger Things, it's the upside down. It's the inversion of the way things are supposed to be. There's a certain logic to this. In the Day of Atonement ceremony with Azazel, and you could might as well go to Leviticus 16. This may be unfamiliar to some. If you go to Leviticus 16, again, everybody knows this is the Day of Atonement passage. The one time of year, Aaron, goes into the Holy of Holies. It says, Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall take the 2 goats, remember the 2 goats, and set them before the Lord at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Aaron shall cast lots over the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord, preposition, divine name, and the other lot is for Azazel. What in the world is that? I mean, a lot of translations have for the scapegoat. Okay, Azazel is actually a proper name. In Second Temple literature, Azazel is Satan. It's the devil figure. It's the figure in charge of the dead. It's the anti, God, the flip equivalent of Eden. You say, what, are they offering sacrifices to Satan? No. Look at what happens. The goat for Azazel, Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord. That's the one that's killed and used as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell for Azazel shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel. What does the high priest do to the goat for Azazel? He puts his hands on it, symbolically transferring the sins of the nation, because the Day of Atonement is like hitting the reset button, okay? It's rebooting. He puts his hands on the head of the goat for Azazel, and they send it out into the wilderness, the place where death is, because that's where sin belongs. It doesn't belong in the camp, okay, where the people of God are and the presence of God is. It belongs out there. They're not offering to Satan. They're sending sin to where it belongs. Get it out of here. This is why Paul in 1 Corinthians 5, when they have to discipline a believer who's unrepentant for immorality, they have to discipline this guy out of the church, that he's delivered unto Satan. It means he's sent out of the place that is holy ground, the church, because the glory of God dwells within each believer. We don't want sin here, we send it out. If the sin's taken care of, then he can come back in. This is just a little portion of what the Old Testament describes as, and we're going to get into in detail, cosmic geography. There's a sense of things that are holy and sacred space, and either normal profane space or evil space. Things under the dominion of God and his presence, and things under the dominion of something else. It's just illustrated here in this part of the ceremony for Azazel. I mean, you read that and that sounds just kind of weird. Goat for Azazel? What in the world's that? He's out in the wilderness because that's the realm of death. Look at the desert, dude. Does that look like Eden looked? No. Okay, that's the whole idea. The Rephaim spirits. Just go to one passage here, because we'll talk about who the Rephaim are in a minute. But also in the underworld, in Sheol, that's the Hebrew word for the underworld, Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. This is God's words to the supernatural rebel, Isaiah 14, who rebels, wants to be like the Most High, and instead is brought low, brought down to the earth and down to the underworld. Right up here, just go up to verse 9, Sheol stirred up to meet you. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol. You become weak as we, become like one of us. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn. It's Hebrew is Hallel ben Shakar. Hallel means shining one. The Latin translation in the Vulgate is Lucifer. That's what Lucifer means in Latin, shining one. How are you fallen from heaven, O day star, son of the dawn? How are you cut down to the ground? Again, you're made low. And even lower than the ground, you're in the Eretz, you're in Sheol, you're in the underworld. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Okay? I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High, but you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Now, if you look at other passages, let me see if I can find it here, if I can find my mouse. Let's see, let's go down one. Let's see, references to the grave and the dead in Isaiah 14. Let's see if I can find it here. Let's see. Leaders of the earth. The shades right here. Let's just click on that. That's the term Rephaim. Where would you see that term if you know your Old Testament well? Who are the Rephaim? It's one of the names for the giant clans. Why are they in Sheol? Why are they in the realm of the dead here? Because they got killed. You say, well, who cares? Let's go to the second rebellion. Here's why you'll care. I'm pointing this out because that verse in Isaiah 14 is going to be one of 2 or 3 verses in the Old Testament for the origin of demons. Genesis 6:4 is a controversial passage. The sons of God see the daughters of men. They cohabit with the daughters of men. They have children by them. The children are called the Nephilim, mighty men of renown upon the earth. Now, what's typically done in churches today is, well, the sons of God there are just people, the line of Seth or somebody else, or they're kings, and there's nothing supernatural going on here, and it's just kind of weird anyway. Like how would we have a supernatural rebellion here and cohabitation and the giants and all that stuff? That's just too weird. So it can't be what the writers intended because it offends us. And so let's just sort of get rid of that. And that's what's done. Now there are a lot of problems with that. It means the daughters of men are the evil line, and the men aren't evil. The women are evil, but the men aren't. That's one problem. If you're going to go down that road. But here's the bigger problem in Genesis 6. Peter and Jude disagree. Peter, for if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment, if he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of the ungodly. And then he goes to Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, you realize this is a chronology. Genesis 6:4, 1 through 4, then the flood, then Sodom and Gomorrah. Angels that sinned, plural. It's not referring to Satan because it's plural. There is no other candidate for what Peter's talking about. You say, well, what about a third of the angels, rebelling with Satan? There isn't a single verse in the Bible that says that. Not one. The only time you ever get the word third and angel in the same verse is the last book of the Bible, Revelation 12, where it refers to war breaking out in heaven at the birth of the Messiah, which is a long time after the flood. Peter and Jude with him, Jude basically says the same thing, describes a supernatural rebellion before the flood, Genesis 6, 1 through 4, the offenders of which were cast into hell and imprisoned there in chains of gloomy darkness. Now, do you notice something already? Where do they get this chains of gloomy darkness business? Because if I remember Genesis 6, let's just go there. Man began to multiply in the face of the land. Daughters were born to them. Sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were attractive, took them wives. The Lord said, hey, my spirit's not going to abide in man forever. His flesh, he's going to give him 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. And you keep going. The Lord saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth. The Lord regretted what he did. He goes to Noah, and then we get the flood. Where are the chains of gloomy darkness? They're not there. And that tells us that Peter and Jude are getting that idea, that material, from somewhere else. They're drawing on material not in the Old Testament, but they're drawing on some other piece of literature or a tradition, a wider tradition, about Genesis 6. Peter and Jude are drawing directly, actually, on ancient Jewish books like 1st Enoch, Jubilees, and the Book of Giants, all from the Second Temple period, and they're all part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Peter and Jude are reading Jewish books, essentially commentary on the Old Testament, on this episode of Genesis 6, 1 through 4, and they bring some of that material into their own writings in the New Testament. That's where they get it. Newsflash. New Testament writers, biblical writers, read books. I mean, we have this weird mythical idea that the Bible guys, they never read anything. They just were kind of like making breakfast one day and then they got zapped and they went into a trance. And then they woke up and there's a scroll in front of them. And it's like, man, I can't wait to read that. I can't wait to read what I just wrote. I wasn't aware that I wrote it because my brain was disengaged. I was getting downloaded. Okay, the Bible, some of you will get this reference. The Bible is not a channeled book. It is not the book of Arantia. Okay, the Bible is a book produced by people whom God providentially prepared for the task. That's what it is. And they read books, they are informed by their environment, their culture, stuff they read, and God knows all of that's going on. He's preparing them from the time they're born up until the moment when he prompts them to produce something for posterity that becomes part of that thing we call the Bible. It's not just downloaded like their brains were not engaged. You know, we really have a deeply flawed conception of inspiration if you think that the Bible is a channeled book. It makes you very vulnerable to criticism, and it makes the Bible vulnerable to criticism in all sorts of ways. Again, this is one of those, it'll take me 5 minutes to destroy your view of the Bible. By using the Bible and using the presumption of how you think you got it. It's not hard. It happens in university classrooms every week. Okay? It's not hard to do. And in this case, Peter and Jude read books. And this material that they're reading, here's the neat part. They providentially read material that actually preserved the original context for Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Because Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is there for a reason. It's not that, again, man, I'm 4 verses short. You know, I got a verse count here. You know, what should I stick in here? Let's like give them a really weird thing. You know, I don't play with their minds a little bit. No, there's a point to why the verses are there. But the context is lost on us. The Old Testament writer assumes his readers will sort of pick up what he's laying down. And some of them did because they write about it later. And Peter and Jude use those works, and they actually recover the original context. Since the 19th century, we've known that Mesopotamian flood stories are very similar to the Bible's flood stories. If you went to college, I can guarantee if you took a religion class, you heard this. Because people love to use this as a wedge between you and your idea that the Bible's different than other literature. Okay, this is sort of a favorite trajectory. Similarities with other documents. This has been well known since the 19th century. The biblical story records an event, but it also does theology. The flood story isn't designed just to tell you there was a flood. The flood story is actually making a theological point, and that's actually what's happening in the first 4, really the first 5 verses of the account. The writer is shooting at something, and what he's shooting at is Mesopotamian religion. He's shooting at some other gods when he does it. But again, that's a context that's lost to us. It wasn't lost to Peter and Jude or the writers of that other literature. So again, books like Enoch preserve this. Here's to get us into this subject, I like to do it this way. We just read Genesis 6, 1 through 4, this weird sons of God stuff that Peter and Jude take at face value, okay? It's just weird, all right? And if it's weird, it must be important, and it is. But look at verse 5. Like, what does this have to do with the first 4 verses? The Lord saw that the wickedness of man, wait a minute, I thought the sons of God were the bad guys. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Well, how do you go from the sons of God violating the boundary between heaven and earth? You know, how do you go from a supernatural rebellion to all the people being wicked all the time? What's going on here? How do you go from one to the other? If you knew the backstory, you wouldn't ask the question. So we're going to go into the backstory. You have the Second Temple writers who are acquainted with that. And in Second Temple Judaism, again, the Judaism that is from the Second Temple was built all the way to first century in Jesus' day. They believed that the events here in Genesis 6:1-4 was responsible for the proliferation of human depravity. They believed that there was a connection between the first 4 verses and verse 5 because they knew the backstory. Now, the backstory, again, in verses like Enoch, or passages like Enoch, we'll talk about the fall of the sons of God. They're called watchers in Enoch's language. And, Book of Daniel uses that term too. We just read that, a little while ago. They have the watchers descend either to or from Mount Hermon, which if you've ever been to Israel, you've probably seen Mount Hermon. You can't miss it. It's the tallest peak there is in that area. It's usually snow-capped. We're going to talk about Mount Hermon when we get to Jesus and cosmic geography, because Jesus visits there. And he has a reason for doing it. And he has things to say when he's there. That again, if you know the backstory, you know why he goes there. Okay? He has a purpose. It's cosmic turf. It has a deeply evil association. So the watchers in the Enoch version, they transgress with women and they teach humanity to destroy themselves. If we read the book of Enoch here, we would read something that sounds really close to Genesis 6, but the story ends with, and when they came down, to mingle with humans, they taught them skills and technologies for warfare, like how to make swords and knives and spears, for warfare, and the art of warfare. They taught them all about plants and herbs to intoxicate themselves, drugs, okay, to produce altered states. They taught them astrology. They taught them arts of seduction to proliferate immorality. They taught them all these things. And again, Enoch, because he's Jewish, he's like, this is terrible. What they taught humans accelerated depravity. It broke up homes. It resulted in bloodshed. It turned their hearts to idolatry, through producing these altered states and visiting the spiritual realms and all this kind of stuff. There's a whole list of sins in the Old Testament that you can put under those 4 categories. These rebels are specifically blamed for kickstarting human self-destruction, accelerating it, giving humans more opportunity and more skill in destroying themselves. Now you can just do it more efficiently. We'll teach you how. Again, here's your list. In Mesopotamian thought, though, there's a story that is the backstory to all this. It's a story of a group of divine beings called the Apkallu. Now, right away, you have to think like a Mesopotamian and think like an Israelite. Israelites are your biblical crowd, followers of Yahweh, at least ostensibly. And the Mesopotamians are followers of any number of gods. Marduk is the big one, when this gets written. He's the lead deity. So you've got Israel, Mesopotamia, good and evil, all that stuff going on. Well, the Mesopotamian story of the flood includes the idea of supernatural beings coming to earth and cohabitation. But in their version, it's a good thing. This is why Babylon is known for its immorality, certainly its idolatry, for its dark arts. Okay, they were an empire. But those are good things because we're Babylon and we're great. There's no one like us. We are the top dog of civilization. And what the Babylonians wanted people to know is the reason we're so wonderful and so awesome and so unbeatable is because the gods helped us create Babylon. They give the gods credit. And in the Apkallu story, the Apkallu are thought of as culture heroes by the Mesopotamians, the great civilizers of their civilization, the ones who taught the Babylonians all sorts of things to build their power. So they're heroes, they're good guys. These 7 sages, there are 7 of them, were created by other gods in the abyss. That ought to ring a bell. Okay? They're created in the abyss. One of their jobs was to ensure the correct functioning of heaven and earth. They had great power, great knowledge, and they're going to teach humans things, ostensibly to create civilization. But again, the Jews look at this and they go, this is horrible. We shouldn't have random bloodshed. We shouldn't have immorality. We shouldn't be worshiping other gods. We shouldn't be doing any of this garbage. But if you're a Babylonian, you're like, yeah, sign me up for that. The wisdom taught by the Apkallu to the Babylonians corresponds precisely to the forbidden knowledge that you'll see listed in Enoch. That's not a coincidence. Again, negative view, positive view. The Apkallu, they also, archaeologists have discovered little figurines, because the Apkallu, again, they're viewed as good guys. They're not viewed as sinister demonic figures by the Babylonians. They would make figures of the Apkallu and bury them in foundations of buildings to protect the building, from whatever the Babylonians didn't like. And their name for those sculptures was Matsare in Akkadian. It means watchers. That's not a coincidence. Again, that's Enoch's term for the sons of God who fell before the flood. It's not a coincidence. He's getting it from Babylonian material. The higher gods in the Babylonian story one day, the Apkallu are kind of mid-level deities. They have important jobs, but they're not the ones who make the decisions. They're not the ones who call the shots. They just do stuff. They're real smart and do stuff. So the higher gods decide, we're kind of sick of humans. You read Enuma Elish or the Gilgamesh epic or something like that, you're going to get this story. We're kind of sick of humans. They make a lot of noise. They just, this was just a bad idea. So you know what? We're going to get rid of them. We're going to send a flood and wipe them out. And then the gods, high-five each other and, great idea, what? Let's just get rid of them. Well, the Apkallu hear this, and they're like, you got to be kidding. I mean, we've invested a lot of time in these people. We've taught them all sorts of things. How in the world, all that work is going to be lost if we just, if they just get destroyed. So they decide, well, okay, we can think of a way to sort of transmit our knowledge to human survivors of the flood, and then we can sort of start up again. Our work will not be lost. Now, the Era epic, which is a Mesopotamian text, is a key source for this. It lists 7 pre-flood kings, each of them accompanied by an assisting Apkallu. So the king said, I owe my success to this deity, and then they list them out in a cuneiform tablet. Each king is assisted by a specific Apkallu, and they're all divine beings. But after the flood, there are texts that mention 4 of them, and they're no longer completely divine. They're of divine descent, but they're also described as partly human. Does this sound familiar? Okay, the Gibborim, the Nephilim, okay. They're also described as other ways. They're 2/3 Apkallu is one description. That's the description given to Gilgamesh, who is called in one cylinder seal the Lord of the Apkallu, and Gilgamesh is a giant in Mesopotamian tradition. Does that sound familiar? Divine beings, cohabitation, offspring that's mixed, they're giants, and they're just bad dudes. Okay, the Babylonians think, well, this is great, good idea. You save civilization here. In the Israelite version in Genesis 6, it's like, this is awful. Because what do the Nephilim and their succeeding generations do? Numbers 13, 32, 33. When Joshua, along with 11 others, Joshua and Caleb and 10 other spies, are sent into the land, they come back in Numbers 13, 32, and 33 and say what? What do the spies say? This place is awesome. Like, it's everything we heard it was going to be. And the people are like, yeah. And the 10 of the spies go, no. Because there's one other detail here. The place is littered with Anakim, who are descended from the Nephilim, great and tall. Essentially, we're going to get our butts kicked. Okay, we do not stand a chance. And Joshua and Caleb are like, don't you remember the Red Sea? Hello? But 10 of them say, we're out of here. And so God says, because you don't believe, you're going to wander in the wilderness now for 40 years until this generation dies out. Now, getting a little ahead of myself for the next session. After 40 years, remember what God does? See, the conquest fails when they see the Anakim, the giants. And Deuteronomy 2 and 3 says the Anakim are Rephaim. Again, all these different giant clan names. God takes them up the other side of Jordan and they pass through Ammon and Moab, and God tells, Joshua, Moses and Joshua in Deuteronomy, now go through Ammon and Moab, but don't bother those people, because the descendants of Esau have already eliminated the giant clans there, the Zamzumim, the Zuzim, and the Amim. So you don't have any business there. Don't bother them. I'm going to send you to Bashan, where the last of the Rephaim live. God intentionally takes them back to confront the same people they ran away from. They have to conquer Bashan, the vestiges of the giant clans in Bashan, before God allows them to cross over and then do the same thing in Canaan. He brings them full circle. You're not getting out of this deal, because these are the elements of the population in the conquest narrative. These must be eliminated because they are spawn of rival gods. They want to seduce you to idolatry. They want to destroy you because you're my people. You say, well, how in the world do we get into that situation? Like where all these nations have other gods. I mean, how do we even get there to begin with? Okay, we'll talk about that in a moment. That's Babel. But in Jewish tradition, here's where demons come from, the demons of the Gospels, who are not the principalities and powers. We'll see that in a moment too. In Jewish tradition, if you asked, where do the demons come from? This is it. Because when the Rephaim die, where do we see them in the Old Testament? Sheol. A demon is the disembodied spirit of one of these guys. That was the belief in Judaism. And again, you can read it all through Second Temple Jewish texts. And I'm sure that maybe there's some of you who have heard that before. But again, this isn't taught in church because you're not encouraged to read the texts that Peter and Jude read that wind up getting drawn on for material in the New Testament. You don't read Isaiah 14. You don't read about the Rephaim. You don't read about Sheol. Again, this is your biblical worldview. So you've got one rebel who brings death and estrangement to humanity. That's the one you know about. That's the serpent. You've got this crowd who rebel against God. Now God, in all traditions, God takes the offenders and assigns them, sends them back to the abyss. In the Mesopotamian story, that's what Marduk does. Marduk says, look, I wanted humanity destroyed. I didn't want you guys interfering. So I'm going to sentence you to go back to the abyss to never return. Every element of Genesis 6:1-4 is accounted for in the Apkallos story, every one. And it's only really been since 2010 that scholars who muck around in cuneiform tablets have assembled the data. So by definition, if you have a commentary at home that doesn't include what I just talked about, I'm sorry, but it's obsolete in Genesis 6. It does not take into consideration the primary source text material that is the backdrop for Genesis 6:1-4. That isn't my fault, I'm just pointing it out. Okay, it's just, this is what happens. People discover things and you learn more things. There was a time when the Dead Sea Scrolls that were unknown. 1947, 48, we've learned lots through them. It's the same thing over here. Now we understand why Peter and Jude could read Enoch and go, we get it, because in the book of the giants, Gilgamesh is actually mentioned by name as a giant. What a coincidence. There are Jewish people who are serious about the Old Testament, and they preserve the backstories, the context of the Old Testament in all sorts of ways, and they write about their discoveries. They write about the dots they're connecting. They do exegesis. They do interpretation. This is what Jewish thinkers are doing in this 500-year gap. They're studying the Old Testament, and they have access to lots of material to help them understand it. And New Testament writers like Peter and Jude, they read some of that stuff, and they bring it into the New Testament because it helps them make an argument. In Peter and Jude's case, who do they compare? Who are the angels that sin? What are they a foil for? False teachers. Wouldn't it make sense to equate a false teacher with like an Apkallu dude or one of the fallen sons of God? Because they were believed to lead people astray. Why in the Gospels are demons called unclean spirits? It's because they don't take a bath? Because they eat like stuff they shouldn't? No. What are, other than like food laws in the Old Testament, what are some other things that make something, either an animal or a person, unclean? Forbidden mixtures. This is why the Watchers are called bastard spirits in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because that's what they are. And they're unclean spirits. I could cite you sources where guys write their dissertation on the phrase unclean spirit. Where does it come from? How is it used? That will make this point. It's just, again, this is what I try to do. I try to give, scholarly material, make it decipherable, because it is kind of important in terms of the worldview of what we're talking about. You have the lesson to learn from Genesis 6 ultimately is not about giant stuff. I mean, people love that stuff, but it's really not about giant stuff. It's about understanding that you have supernatural enemies who enjoy your destruction. It's about your living a legacy that is partly your fault, but partly one imposed upon you by intelligent evil. Now, you can say, well, all those guys are locked up in the abyss, and they are. Okay? They are. Demons are at times allowed to get out, like in the Gospels, and they possess people. They harm individuals. That's not our real problem. Our real problem is the next set, which are different. But the idea that there is intelligent evil out there that seeks your destruction is an important one. Now, when it comes to the biblical story, it's kind of interesting. Who destroys the lineage of the Nephilim in the Bible, in the Old Testament? Okay, Moses and Joshua in the conquest. And then the last, in fact, Joshua winds up his conquest narrative this way. How does Joshua define success? It's in Joshua 12, or Joshua 11, 21, 22. It says, there are no more Anakim in the land, except the ones that escaped to the Philistine cities. Where do we find the vestiges of them later on? It's Goliath. He's from one of these cities. Goliath has, some brothers too. It's David's men who take care, and David, of course, of the rest of the line. Isn't it fascinating that Moses, Joshua, and David, who are three archetypal figures of the Messiah, wind up destroying the giant clans? That's not a coincidence. Moses, the Messiah is the prophet like unto Moses. Joshua, it's Yeshua. I mean, how clear can that be? Okay? Captain of the Lord's host and all that. Of course, David, the man after God's own heart, the messianic archetype. Again, none of this stuff is coincidence. It's designed to get you to think in a certain way, in this case about evil. The messianic role is telegraphed, somewhat cryptically. Now, again, we don't have time to go into all these things, but you could go to YouTube. God forbid I send you to YouTube. Because, I'm on YouTube so many times and don't know how I got there. But if Google my name and the time of Jesus' birth. There is specific imaging about the timing of Jesus' birth, and the times and the seasons, that is a direct polemic. It's a theological poke in the eye to the Watcher story. There are women in Jesus' genealogies whose lives mimic the circumstances of either sexual rebellion or sexual crimes committed to them. All four of the women in Jesus' genealogy have that. You get Paul's reference in Galatians 3:19, 20. The law was added because of transgressions, plural. So it's not like Adam and Eve, because they do one thing. What if the transgressions we're talking about here are the crimes of the Watchers? Because Galatians 3 goes into chapter 4 and talks about the timing of Jesus. In the fullness of time, the Son of God was born. You actually, again, if you read Unseen Realm, you're going to get all this, but there are actually Jewish texts that develop that thought, that the law was added to circumscribe or put halters on, put boundaries around human self-destruction that was proliferated as a result of what happened here before the flood. The law is added to help humans slow down in their self-destruction, is the point. Again, I'm not inventing any of these ideas. This is all ancient material that provides context for what Paul's saying and other writers. And, I know Stovall recently preached a message on 1 Peter 3. Why does Peter mix the flood, the angels that sinned, the spirits in prison, Noah, the ark, and the resurrection? What is he on? What is this guy thinking of? Did he just say, I need a chapter to write, I'm going to take all these things, toss them in the blender, and hit the switch, and then we'll just write something? No, all of those things are related. in his mind because of this whole issue. The resurrection deals with depravity because you have a resurrection and ascension, and then the Spirit comes to indwell people to help them not destroy themselves. Again, all these things are connected. The big one in many ways is the last one here, the third rebellion. This is the Sunday school story we all know, but we never see. Because again, we're cut off from some material. We all know the story of Babel, Genesis 11:1-9. What we don't know is this one. When the Most High, again, that's not a brain teaser, we know who that is. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, and when he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Wait a minute. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God? But the Lord's portion, but Yahweh's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. Okay, when was humanity divided into nations? That would be Babel. So when God did that, when he punished humanity because he wanted them to overspread the earth, God repeats the Edenic mandate after the flood to Noah and his sons, and it's from his sons that all the nations in Genesis 10, derive from in some way. Instead of overspreading the earth, though, they congregated a place called Babel, and they built a tower, to make themselves a great name. So God says, okay, this is like the opposite of what I asked you to do. So let me get this straight, God says. We had a fall in Eden. You got expelled from that, and that meant death and estrangement from me, your Father and your Creator. Then we unfortunately had another supernatural rebellion to deal with, Genesis 6:1-4. The result of that was the proliferation of evil and wickedness and depravity among the human population. It was so great that I looked down and I saw that every inclination of the human heart was only evil continually. That's Genesis 6:5. So I sent a flood, but we saved a remnant out of the flood. And I gave them 120 years to repent, but basically nobody did. But now, when you guys get out of the ark and you have kids, I show up and I repeat the Edenic mandate because there is no plan B. We're sticking with plan A here. I want a family. I want you and my family. I want to return to earth, and I want the earth to become Eden. But it has to start right here. Okay, you got to start with the original job. You've got to be loyal to me. Obey. You're not going to earn your salvation. If you believe that I am the Most High, that I am your Creator, I am your Father, you believe that I want the things that you want, I want to give them to you. If you believe that I am who I say I am, let's get with the plan here. Be my partner. Be my child, be my partner. And so what does humanity do? Now, we'd like to build a tower. Because if we build a tower, then we're going to become famous. So it's a little more than that because everybody agrees, biblical scholars agree, that the tower they built was a ziggurat. If you know a little bit about ziggurats, it helps. Ziggurats were part of temple complexes in ancient Mesopotamia. You built a ziggurat to connect heaven and earth, and you would meet at that place to offer sacrifice and barter with the god or the gods. A ziggurat, part of a temple complex, was something you built to bring the deity to you. God's like, that's really not the idea. Okay, I don't come at your beck and call. Okay, the God of Israel will not be tamed. This is what the thinking was about building, these temple complexes. And God says, okay, here we are again. You don't want to be loyal to me. You don't want me to be your God. You don't want these things. I'm going to give you what you apparently are asking for. I'm going to give you a divorce. I'm going to disinherit you. I'm going to cut you off from me. I'm going to disperse you and divide you up geographically, and I'm going to assign each of the nations, to one of the sons of God. And they're going to get assigned to you too. And what I want them to do, again, this is wider in the Old Testament, what I want them to do is I want them to essentially be placeholders. I still love humanity. I don't want humanity enslaved and destroyed and corrupted and basically ground into dust. And I certainly don't want humans to worship the other gods because I'm their maker. So what I want is I want the nations ruled justly according to my character and my principles. But I'm done with you. I'm going to judge your wickedness, and we're going to see how that goes. In the meantime, verse 9, here's what we're going to do. There is no plan B. So what I'm going to do, if you're not willing to be loyal to me, is I'm going to create more humans. I'm going to take one guy from Ur, his name is Abram, and his wife is Sarah, and they're perfect because they can't have kids. They're perfect because I'm going to supernaturally enable them to have a child so that everybody knows this nation, their descendants exist because of my power. That's what we're going to do. So this is what he does. What happens in the biblical storyline right after Babel? Genesis 12. What is it? It's the covenant with Abram. So God is still interested in the nations because when he makes a covenant with Abram and he promises him a seed, he says, it's going to be through your seed that all of the nations of the earth will be blessed. And Paul later on picks up on this idea and he talks about, well, the seed was actually like one seed, it was Jesus, and of course he goes all the way back through Abraham and the genealogies and all that stuff. And it's going to be the Messiah who is going to reunite the earth, reunite the nations. This is the plan. So God abandons them. Now what this leads to, if you want good bedtime reading, you can read my article about Deuteronomy 32:8. Now, most of your Bibles will say sons of Israel. He divided them up according to the number of the sons of Israel or the children of Israel. The Dead Sea Scrolls say sons of God. Here I made you a nice little picture of the Dead Sea Scroll. If you read Hebrew, it's B'nai Elohim, sons of God. And I talk about this scroll in that article. But you don't need to be a textual critic. Think about the story. The nations are divided at Babel, and they're divided up according to the sons of Israel. Israel didn't exist yet. They're only going to exist after Babel. So it makes no sense to divide the nations up according to the number of the sons of Israel, because Israel, what's that? They don't even exist. Again, the correct reading is sons of God, like the Dead Sea Scrolls have. It's the oldest text we have, and so we should go with it. ESV goes with it, NLT, NRSV. Some of your mainline translations have incorporated the Dead Sea Scrolls into that passage, and they should, because it makes a lot of sense. Now, ultimately, what happens here, let's go back to Psalm 82. Israel, the plan is that God has abandoned the nations, and Israel is supposed to be his family, and his family is supposed to be, think of how Israel is described in the Old Testament, a kingdom of priests. There's one. What do priests do? They're mediators between God and men. Sure.
Don't lose your thought.
Okay.
Just because so many people don't know, I want them to understand. When you're saying in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you're talking about the biblical text.
The biblical text.
When he says Dead Sea Scrolls, he's talking about the Bible that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That is the oldest text that we have.
This is Deuteronomy 32, preserved in one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's a good point. The Dead Sea Scrolls, two categories, biblical and non-biblical. Biblical scrolls are copies of the Hebrew Bible. Non-biblical stuff is stuff that's not the Hebrew Bible. So it's real easy to remember. But if you go to Psalm 82, again, Israel was supposed to be the mediator between God, the true God, and all these other nations. See, what happens at Babel is the Old Testament explanation for why the other nations have other gods, where pantheons come from. Because the sons of God who are given charge over the nations don't do a good job. Here's what they do. We read it earlier today in Psalm 82. God is judging the gods in his council. How long will you judge unjustly? Show partiality to the wicked. Give justice to the weak and the fatherless. Maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. Rescue the weak and needy. You're not doing all this stuff. And the result is, look at what's in, your people have neither knowledge or understanding. They walk about in darkness. The whole foundations of the earth are shaken. Okay, what I wanted was for you to rule justly because I still love humanity, and I want to use my new people, Israel, to be a conduit of truth to them, from me to them, and bring them back into the family. But what you're doing is resulting in chaos throughout the whole earth. The psalm ends with the psalmist saying, "Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you shall inherit all the nations." The psalmist wants this to end. He wants the chaos of the nations taken care of. The reason I have this highlighted, again, we can't go into this either, but if you know what the Septuagint is, it's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. The word here for arise in the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible is the word for resurrection. And it happens 3 or 4 times where the resurrection is associated with the reclaiming of the nations. This is just one of several passages. And Paul knows this. He knows it really well. Because 5 or 6 times, Paul, when he talks about the resurrection, he doesn't talk about being his ideal weight. He doesn't talk about getting his hair back, getting better eyesight. As soon as he thinks of the resurrection, he thinks about the conquest of the rulers, the powers, the principalities. He does it half a dozen different places. He thinks of one and goes to the other. Now, again, this is the way it was supposed to work, but it doesn't work this way. And what this is the root. We'll cover this in the last 5 minutes here. This whole idea of God scattering the nations, assigning them to other gods, and those gods become corrupt. They destroy their nations. They turn the hearts of their people to worship them. They turn the hearts of people to idolatry. It's a mess. It's the Old Testament explanation for after the flood, everybody knew who the true God was. After Babel, things just really go downhill. Okay. It turns into the system that we sort of know about the ancient world. You know, you could go to Plato and find the same worldview. You can go to Greco-Roman writers. The pagan world believed the same thing, that they worship the gods they do and their neighbors worship some other god because that's how the Most High wanted it. You'll actually find that in non-biblical pagan texts. Again, when Paul goes to a pagan city, he knows that they share the same worldview, and it's a platform for the gospel. But before we get there, that's going to be the subject of the next session. This is the foundation for what we call spiritual warfare and cosmic geography. Daniel 10, the Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece. Where do we get this idea of supernatural princes over nations? Deuteronomy 32. The Babel story. That's where it begins. 1 Samuel 5, this is one of my favorites because it's one of the most obscure, but it's funny. Remember the story when the Philistines go to war with the Israelites and they capture the Ark of the Covenant? Okay, so what do? They take the Ark of the Covenant back to the temple of Dagon, all right, and they set it up in the temple of Dagon. And again, this is a familiar Sunday school story that we like to tell kids, again, because it's funny. I'll have to go to and just flip over and go to 1 Samuel 5 because there's a line in it that we all miss. So they take the ark over to Dagon's temple. Might help if I put the chapter in. And here's the story. They took Dagon, put the ark in front of Dagon. Verse 3, when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, behold, Dagon had fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him back in his place. But when they rose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen down, face down on the ground before the ark of the Lord. And this time, if I can find my mouse here, the head of Dagon and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. Now, that's the story we tell. Because it's funny, Dagon is reduced to a stump. And granted, okay, it's comical. But we miss the next verse. This is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. Where they found Dagon defeated, they don't walk on it, because now that ground is under dominion of Yahweh. In other words, can you imagine? I mean, this must have been like some pirouette, because you got to go into Dagon's house to do stuff. And so we just got to kind of step around that, cordon it off or whatever, because they're not taking any chances. They're not taking any chances. It is now ground that belongs to Yahweh. See, the nations around Israel are under dominion of fallen gods. Israel is Yahweh's portion. And Yahweh, when he does things like this and conquers their deities, they get it. 1 Samuel 26, when David gets driven out of Judah, if we click through that, he has this lament, and he's basically shedding tears over, well, good grief, I have to leave Judah, and I got to go pretend I'm a crazy man over in Philistine territory, because Saul hates me, they hate me, how am I going to stay alive? And he laments that, how can I worship the Lord? How can I pray? Because I'm no longer in Judah. It's not a denial of God's omnipresence. That's the way a modern would think about it. He's thinking, for me to be rightly related to God, I have to be in his land. I have to be in his space, sacred space. 2 Kings 5, probably my favorite example. This is Naaman the leper. Again, how many times have we heard this in Sunday school? So Naaman has leprosy, and he's got a little slave girl living in his house that they captured from Israel. And I'm paraphrasing here, but she's doing whatever task she's doing, and here comes Naaman, the captain of Syria. He's a big dude, and he's whining about his leprosy. I'd whine too if I had leprosy. And the little slave girl says, well, why don't you just go down and see Elisha the prophet? He'll take care of that. And he's like, what? Sure, just go down and visit Elisha. So he takes a bunch of his men, and he goes to Elisha in Israel. And he gets to Elisha's house, and the prophet won't even come out to talk to him. He says, yeah, I know he's here. I know who he is. Just tell him to go dip in the Jordan 7 times. He'll be okay. So Naaman's like, this is disrespectful. Doesn't he know who I am? And he gets all in a huff, we're just going to go back home, And again, his servants say, well, again, Mike's paraphrase, well, if he'd have told you to do something crazy, you probably would have done it. Oh, yeah, but the Jordan is like, we got better rivers back home. What is this thing? It's like a little sewer or something, And his men say, well, what's the harm? Just try it. So he says, okay, I'll try it, and then we'll go home. So he dips himself 7 times in the Jordan. What happens? You know the story. He's healed. So he can't believe it. He's thrilled. He goes back to Elisha's house, and this time Elisha comes out to talk to him. And Naaman's like, thank you. I can't believe it. Can I give you something? Can I pay you something? This is just amazing. And Elisha's like, no. We're not doing any of that. And so Naaman says, now I know that Yahweh is the God of all gods. And he says, from this point forward, I will not sacrifice to any other. And then what does he ask Elisha for? Anyone remember? So this is the part of the story we skip over. He asks him for dirt. He said, would it be okay if I fill the bags of with dirt, and as much as my mule train can carry, to take it back? Because I'm an important guy. I got to go home to Syria, and part of my job is I have to go into the temple of Rimmon with the king. And the king's kind of old, and when the king bends over, I got to do this, But I want, he wants God to know, and he wants Elisha to know that I'm not worshiping Rimmon. Now, he probably used the dirt to spread out at his house somewhere to offer sacrifice on what? Cosmic geography, on holy ground, land under dominion of the God he knew was real. Maybe he took some with him in the temple of Rimmon, put a little bag, put some in my pockets, who knows? But he wants dirt. You can't understand the impact of that whole scene without Deuteronomy 32. This is Yahweh's portion. He has dominion over this land. We are attached to him and his land. Everything else is hostile. It's under dominion of something else. Deuteronomy 32 frames the entire rest of the Bible. Because from this point on, it's Israel against the nations, and it's Yahweh against the gods. That's the whole story right there in a nutshell. It frames the entirety of the Old Testament. And since this is where we get the Prince of Persia, Prince of Greece, all this stuff, that gets picked up in the New Testament, both in the life of Jesus and in what Paul says and in our ultimate destiny, believe it or not. All those things bleed back into what we just talked about. Find your seats as quickly as you can. And our last session, again, not to insult your intelligence because you can read, behind me is the supernatural worldview of the Bible, specifically focused on the work of Jesus in the New Testament. You know, it's the whole New Testament. So again, bird's eye view, we're just picking our spots here. Again, just to give you a feel for the flavoring. So to this point, just to summarize things, we've talked about God's original desire to have a human family coexisting with his supernatural family. Heaven comes to earth. We have Eden. We have the creation of humankind as God's imagers, his proxies, his stand-ins, again, whatever vocabulary helps. They are his children. They are fit for sacred space. They are tasked with making the rest of the world like Eden, to spread the goodness of God, to spread life as God wants it lived everywhere on the globe. That's destroyed with the fall, the first of 3 rebellions. The fall brings upon humanity a death problem and a separation from God. That rebellious path continues. We have the precursor event to the flood, Genesis 6:1-4, which produces a number of bad results. In immediate Old Testament history, we have a lethal threat to the people of God, Israel, in the form of the Nephilim and their descendants. Moses, Joshua, and David take care of that problem. But what they cannot address is the fact that fallen sons of God, the Watchers, against supernatural rebels, teach, deceive, misdirect, blind human beings to their own self-destruction. They accelerate depravity. There's an animus there. Humans are essentially taught to more efficiently destroy their own lives and the lives of those around them. Their hearts are turned to idolatry. God judges that with the flood. He consigns the rebellious supernatural beings to the pit, to the abyss, chains of gloomy darkness in the language of Peter and Jude. By the way, I think Revelation 9 describes the release of the Watchers as a precursor to the end of days, which ultimately is a transition to, the day of the Lord and the future age, the age to come. But we've got a serious problem there. And then we have the Babel problem, where the nations are divorced from God. They are assigned, allotted is the biblical word, to the sons of God, who corrupt them and in turn show their own corruption by turning the hearts of everyone to idolatry, soliciting worship from humans instead of directing them back to the true God and ruling them according to the moral character of the true God. They turn their populations into their slaves and destroy them. This is why the psalmist cries out for an end to this situation. So humanity is fragmented. It is in a maelstrom of depravity. It is separated from the true God and the knowledge of the true God. It's just one big mess. It's one big chaotic mess. And so the expectation is that the seed of Abraham, the seed, the Messiah, is going to show up and fix this, all 3 of these, all of these conditions. And again, we can't drill down into all these things, but I mentioned there are certain theological signals to the birth and the genealogy of Jesus that are aimed at the Watcher story. We can't get into that now. We know about the resurrection, the cross event, the cross, the death of Jesus and the resurrection. We know that that takes care of the death problem, because resurrection, again, he is the first fruits of the resurrection, and we will inherit the resurrection. We will be raised with him at the last day to eternal life. Again, we know those points of the theology. So we know how the work of Jesus cures the death problem. It brings the believer back into the family of God. But I want to focus here on a few things in the Gospels and in the epistles and ultimately in the book of Revelation that sort of touch on the other 2 things. The problem of depravity, the problem of cosmic geography especially. There are things in the New Testament that what we just described in the last hour, little seeds of that, little breadcrumbs of those things are seeded throughout the New Testament. And the problem is our ability to detect them, because we don't quite know what we're looking at, because we have not spent enough time in our Old Testament understanding it in its own context to be able to see the breadcrumb trails, but they are there. My book, Reversing Hermann, drills down specifically on the Genesis 6 story. How does that story bleed into the New Testament, and specifically the mission of Jesus? Again, we'll say a little bit about that here, but I want to focus on cosmic geography because I think there's an important aspect to that that's really tied into our destiny that really matters, and I think especially for our gathering today. So you're only going to get a little taste of what's lurking in your Bible. What will jump out at you if you're aware. And it's good stuff, really, it is. So the ministry of Jesus, Jesus' first coming, the first advent, he is going to inaugurate the kingdom, means he's going to kickstart the kingdom of God, the rule of God on earth once more. And he's also going to make a mockery in his own special way of the cosmic powers. So he does this in different ways, and just a smattering here. It's no coincidence that the inauguration, the beginning of the kingdom, when Jesus begins his ministry, he starts talking about the kingdom. I mean, John had done this as a precursor as well. But he starts saying things like the kingdom of God is present, the kingdom of God is among you, so on and so forth. When he starts talking about the kingdom, when he inaugurates his ministry, he also, to demonstrate his authority, he couples those announcements with specific episodes of the expulsion of demons. If you look in your New Testament, you will see when the kingdom gets talked about, you have these sorts of events. That is not a coincidence. It's intentional. It's deliberate. And I think one of the more interesting ones is here in Matthew 8. I'm probably going to go a little past 3 o'clock, but oh well, just drag me away. I've been good to this point. Okay, Jesus heals 2 men with demons. When he came to the other side, to the country of the Gadarenes or the Gerasenes in other synoptics, gospels, 2 demon-possessed men met him coming out of the tombs, so fierce that no one could pass that way. And behold, they cried out, "What have you to do with us, O Son of God? Have you come here to torment us before the time?" And then we get the pigs and the swine and all that. What I want to draw your attention to is how the demons address Jesus. Okay, "O Son of God." Usually, when people address Jesus, they call him Son of David in the Gospels. It's a consistent pattern. But here the demons somehow know that he's not just the Son of David, he's the Son of God. If you go over to the same account in Mark, crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What have you to do with me?" This is legion, so it's still more than one. "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" In Luke is going to use the same language, Son of the Most High. Now, what I want to draw your attention to is, isn't it unusual, or doesn't it draw your attention, that when Jesus goes into territory that is under Gentile control, they're raising pigs, okay? That's an indication, okay? And historically, this part of the land was under Gentile control in Jesus' day. That when he's among Jews, they refer to him either as Jesus or the Son of God or some pejorative, But when he's in Gentile turf and he confronts supernatural powers, they refer to him as the Son of God and the Son of the Most High. Why should that stand out? Because he is Lord of the Gentile nations as well. Jesus goes into Gentile places and does things to telegraph a simple point. I am not the Messiah of the Jew alone. I have dominion over territory that is under the authority, at least to this point, of other gods. And they know it. They call him Son of the Most High. Where do we see that language in the Old Testament? The Babel story. Okay, it's designed to take your mind back by using that specific phrase, back to the conditions of cosmic geography in the Old Testament, and to telegraph the point that the supernatural beings know who this is. Now, I agree with Paul, and we'll get to Paul in a moment, where Paul in 1 Corinthians 2 verses 6 through 8, said, had the rulers of this world, which is a Pauline phrase for supernatural powers, and the Gospels use it too. Satan is called the ruler of this world and all that. But Paul says, had the rulers of this world known what the outcome would have been, they would never have crucified the Lord of glory. In other words, they're not idiots. They're not thinking like, oh, Jesus is here and he's here to die on the cross. And so if we kill him, that's the beginning of the end for us. Let's do that. No, they know who he is and they know why he's there. Why else would the Son of God show up? Why else would the Son of the Most High show up? He's here to do this silly Eden thing again. He wants to reclaim the nations. He wants to kickstart Eden again. He wants to bring the nations back into the family. He wants to restore Eden. He wants God to have his way. Well, we're not going to let that happen. So that the easy solution for them is to kill him, which is exactly what God needs to happen. Okay, now, Jesus knows the plan. He knows the mechanism for this, but they don't. Like Paul says, had they known, they never would have done this. They're not idiots. Also, what Jesus does when he starts talking about the kingdom. The first time he sends out disciples, he sends out 70. Some of your New Testaments will say 72. It doesn't matter because it refers to the same thing. Why 70? He doesn't send out 12. 12 disciples, 12 tribes of Israel. No, he sends out 70. Why? 70, if you use the traditional Hebrew text of Genesis 10, the nations involved in the Babel story, if you count them, there's 70 of them. In the Septuagint, there's 72 because the translator divided two. He divided a couple pairs. That's why you get the number difference. But both numbers refer back to the table of nations that were divided at Babel. If you are a literate Jew and you happen to be either on the scene or you read the gospel where Jesus, the Son of David, Son of the Most High, starts talking about the kingdom and sends out 70 disciples who have authority over demons, you know what's going on. You know what this signals. He is here to take back the nations. I am not the God and the Messiah of the Jew alone. I am Lord of every last inch of turf here. And this is a symbolic gesture to make that point. It's a cosmic geographical act to those who have Babel ringing in their heads. This coincides with Satan, quote, falling like lightning from heaven, Luke 10:18. You also get the dragon cast down in Revelation 12, which again, if you read the passage, and I already referenced it, refers to the first coming of the Messiah. The first coming of the Messiah results in some sort of casting down of the devil. What is that? What might that mean? Okay, again, this isn't original to me, but I think this is the view that makes the most sense, given all the other things we've talked about and a lot of the things we haven't talked about today. The serpent figure, the original rebel that we know as Satan, was cast down in Eden to the underworld, to the earth. And in Israelite cosmology, the underworld is in the earth. So he's cast out of heaven to the earth. He becomes Lord of the dead. So it can't refer to that because this is something different that is associated with the announcement of the kingdom. Okay, my view is that what this means is that Satan is expelled from the presence of God or the role of the accuser who brings charge against people because he owns them. Another way of saying it, if Satan has rightful ownership of every human life because everything dies, one of his roles that's described elsewhere in Scripture is to accuse the brethren. If you look at this role, the terminology of the accuser is drawn from different passages. Job 1 and 2 is probably the most familiar, just for the idea of accusation. But he lays claim to every human being on the planet. When the kingdom of God is begun and the king announces it, and the king is going to give his life to make the kingdom of God a reality, that's over and done with. In what way? Here's the point. Anyone who's a member of Jesus' kingdom is no longer under the authority of the Lord of the dead because of the resurrection. So if you are a member of that kingdom, this dude over here has nothing to say. He no longer owns you. Your destiny is no longer with him. He is a prosecutor without a case. Okay? That's what he is. And again, what I'm suggesting is when these things happen, when they're said in the Gospels, they have a context that drifts back into the Old Testament, that needs to be, noodled a little bit when it gets to that. Now, I've alluded to this one. Here's a map. This is God's leading of Moses and Joshua. I'll try to get out of my own way here. When they are done with the 40 years of wandering, as I mentioned before, God directs Moses and Joshua to go up the other side of Jordan, the eastern side, if you're looking at the map from your direction. It's not Canaan proper, it's the other side. And he tells them in Deuteronomy 2 and 3, let's just take a look at it, even though I alluded to this before. Deuteronomy 2 and 3, he says, the writer says, as soon as all the men of war had perished and were dead from among the people, the Lord said to me, today you are to cross the border of Moab at Ar. And when you approach the territory of the people of Ammon, do not harass them or contend with them. For I will not give you any of the land of the people of Ammon as a possession, because I've already given it to the sons of Lot, who are, again, peripherally related to Abraham. I've already given it to the sons of Lot. It's also counted as a land of Rephaim. Rephaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites call them Zamzumim, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. But, click in there, find my mouse, but the Lord destroyed them. The Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, and they dispossessed them and settled them in their place, as he did for the people of Esau who lived in Seir, when he destroyed the Horites before them and dispossessed them and settled in their place, even to this day, as he did for the Avim who lived in the villages as far as Gaza, the Caphtorim, who came from Caphtor. These are all also roots of the Philistines. And he goes down through the list, and he says, look, on the other side of Jordan, you don't molest the people of Moab and Ammon, because I've already either given it to descendants of Abraham, and there's no giant problem there. I already took care of that. Descendants of Esau, cleared them out. The Ammonite, we don't have a problem there. What we do have a problem with is Bashan. The region up here to the north, at the top of the map, Bashan. Let's get a better look at it. This is the region of Bashan. You see the Sea of Galilee right here. Bashan is, the territorial name. Ashtaroth and Edrei are two significant cities. You see if I have this note here. Just a few notes about the region of Bashan. In Canaanite, it was known as Bathan, TH, which is a word for serpent. That's a little creepy. Israelites are going to be a little creeped out by that. Ashtaroth and Edrei in Canaanite, in Ugaritic, that's a Canaanite language or Northwest Semitic language, those two cities are mentioned by name, and they are described as gateways to the netherworld. They freaked even the pagans out, okay? So it's like, we just don't, we don't really want to go there. It's just, Bashan is kind of creepy to begin with, and we don't want to hang out at these places because these are gateways to the netherworld, to the underworld. In Old Testament times, at the top of, what we'll see in a moment, at the top of Bashan, the region there's a mountain. It's Mount Hermon. We'll come back to that point. But at the foot of Mount Hermon was built a temple to Baal. Baal is referred to as the Lord of the underworld in Canaanite literature. He's Lord of the dead. Baal-zebul. Beelzebul in the Gospels. Baal-zebul is Ugaritic for Prince Baal. Baal is Baal, Zebul is the word for prince, the Lord of the dead. This is why Baal is a Satan figure, in a lot of this material. Prince Baal. So this is not where you'd go like for R&R. Okay? Where do we want to go for vacation this year? Oh, Dad, I've got a great idea. Let's go to Bashan. It's just, think of something else. So here we are, a little bit more of a blow up. You've got Bashan, Sea of Galilee here in Jesus' day. Just fix that location in your mind. You've got Ashtaroth and Edrei nearby. There again, Sea of Galilee, a little bit north. This is going to be actually adjacent to where the Temple of Baal was erected in Old Testament days, is Caesarea Philippi, also known in Jesus' day as Banias or Panias with a P. What happens at Caesarea Philippi? It's at the foot of Mount Hermon, in the region of Bashan. This is like ground zero for just awful, evil, chaotic, nasty stuff. What happens at Caesarea Philippi? This is the place that Jesus goes with his disciples, and they're at, there they are. Caesarea Philippi, you've got the grotto of Pan, Pon, Banias, Bashan, all this stuff, the gates of hell. And this is the place where Jesus has this conversation with his disciples where he says, who do men say that I am? And the disciples, well, some say this and some say that. And he asked Peter, who do you say I am? And he says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, that's good, Peter. Don't get a big head about it because the Spirit of God had to show you that. You're not that smart. Okay? But we'll give you some points. He says, you're Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church. Now, I finally got to Bashan, and specifically to this location last year. It's really hard to miss the rock. It's dominated by a big rock, a cliff. And inside is the grotto of Pan. In Jesus' day, it was also a temple of Zeus, which is a real slap in the face to the true God because Zeus was conceived as the Most High in pagan religion. But a lot of people argue about this, okay? They say, well, the way we should interpret this is Jesus is saying, Peter, and upon this rock, I'm going to build my church. And Petros, Peter sounds like Petra, rock, so Jesus is making a pun. And Peter's the first pope, so we should all be Catholic. And the Protestants say, no. No, the rock is Christ himself, and the rock was God in the Old Testament, because that's what 1 Corinthians 10 says. The rock was Jesus, the rock was God. And so we're going to take that and import it into the Gospels, and none of us should be Catholic. We should all be Protestant. Okay, what I'm suggesting, and I'm not alone, I didn't come up with this view, this is a fairly common view, that the rock they're talking about is where they're standing. Okay, because it was known as the gates of hell. It's the place where the Lord of the dead was worshipped, and you got these locations in the region that you go visit the Lord of the dead. It's this place. So I don't think the Protestants or the Catholics are correct on this. I think Jesus is saying, you all know what this place is. Upon this rock, right here, I'm going to build my church. This is where it begins. And the gates of hell, a lot of our translations have, this is ESV, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Now you'll notice, at least here, you see the word against has a little arrow, and it doesn't have any English words under it. That's because the word against in English is not represented by a Greek word in the original text. It's supplied by the translator to help it make sense. See, the gates of hell will not prevail against it sounds like the church is taking a beating, and the church is going to survive while the gates of hell beat against it. It'll be okay because it's the church. No, actually, you should translate it without that preposition. And then you'd come up with something like, the gates of hell will not withstand it. See, that reverses the image. Now it's not the church taking the beating, it's the church administering the beating. Okay? So, what you have Jesus saying here is in effect, you all know what this place is. I'm going to turn Satan's domain into his tomb. Okay? We are going to reverse what's going on here. And the real kicker is, well, we'll get to that part. Oh, let's just go. I'll get to the kicker in a moment. Right after this incident, it says, after 6 days, they're there at Caesarea Philippi 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain. Again, if you're there, you just look around and where's a high mountain here? We got this big rock here and it's a cliff, but it's not a mountain, it's a cliff. Oh, there's one right over there. How could we miss it? It's Mount Hermon. What happened at Mount Hermon? Again, if you're reading Second Temple Jewish material about the Genesis 6 story, Mount Hermon is where the watchers descend and covenant together with themselves to corrupt humanity. So Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up into Mount Hermon, and what happens there? It's the transfiguration. So Jesus goes there and he manifests who he really is. He exposes himself, in his glory, as if to say what? I'm here. Do something about it. Okay, my view is that when Jesus does this at Caesarea Philippi and Mount Hermon, he is picking a fight. This is well into his ministry, and the reason I say that is what happens after. This is just some stuff about Hermon. The Gospels actually don't identify the mountain. The church tradition says it's Mount Tabor. You know why? Because Constantine's mom said it was. I'm not making that up. Constantine's mom was a serious believer, and she fancied herself as like an archaeologist. And so she went around to places in the Holy Land and said, this is where this happened, this is where that happened, this is this place. And people are like, hey, you're the emperor's mom. We're not going to disagree. And it just becomes church tradition. But the Gospels never identify it. And if you're in the region, there's only one mountain candidate there, and that's Hermon. But oh well. And again, it's not just me. Lots of people take this view I'm giving to you. But it's really interesting that after these two events, you read this in Mark. After he goes to Caesarea Philippi, and he pokes Satan in the eye. Then he goes to Mount Hermon and digs, that whole bunch, okay? It says this, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He's picking a fight. It's time to get the show on the road. Now, Peter freaks out, if you remember the passage. This is the passage where Peter says, no way. This isn't going to happen to you. And then Jesus has to say, look, get behind me, Satan. And the whole point is, if you oppose this, you're on his side. You're an adversary. Don't put yourself in an adversarial position to what I have to do, what I'm going to do. This is why I'm here. But he begins to teach them that he has to die. So what happens? They leave this area. They go to Jerusalem, and that's when you have Palm Sunday, and a week later, he's dead. Mission accomplished. It's a provocation. Jesus goes to these places and provokes a response. And the gospel stories about Satan entering into Judas, and you know all the rest of that. But he does these things to provoke and set the stage for what must happen. He must die. Why does he have to die? To defeat death, you have to have a resurrection. You can't have a resurrection unless you die. It's as plain as day. But it doesn't register with them. And again, I don't want to poke fun at the disciples because I don't think they were dumb. The real issue is, and I discussed this in Unseen Realm at length. Here's the passage in Paul I alluded to earlier. Among the mature, we do impart wisdom, though it is not a wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away. Oh, yeah, they are. Paul has read Psalm 82. You're going to die like men. But we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. None of the rulers of this age understood this, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. The disciples didn't understand it either. Do you realize, just a little bunny trail here, do you realize there isn't a single passage that has, in the Old Testament, that prophesies a Messiah who will be God incarnate, who will die a sacrificial death and rise from the dead? Now, all those individual items are somewhere in the Old Testament, and most of them kind of cryptically. The point is that the plan is scattered throughout the Old Testament. The pieces are not put together. We only have the pieces put together because the New Testament is written in hindsight. Okay, in the Unseen Realm, I talk about I refer to this as the Messianic mosaic. It's like a puzzle. It's like you have to put a puzzle together without the box lid. Okay, the pieces are just fragmented. It's only afterwards that the picture becomes clear. I love Luke 24. This is after the resurrection, and they have the risen Christ, the disciples assembled there. The risen Christ is standing in front of them, and they don't get it. That Luke actually says that Jesus had to open their minds so that they could understand. And again, it's not that they're dumb. It's that they didn't know all the pieces or how the pieces went together. They only know this in hindsight. Jesus tells them the Spirit's going to guide you into all this. The Spirit's going to help you out. And he does, and that's why when the Gospels get written and the disciples are out there doing their thing in the book of Acts, they come to understand how everything fit together. And the text will say, and then they remembered what Jesus said about this or that passage. It's like, oh, another piece goes right where it belongs. They're assembling it as they go and as they go about their ministries. They don't know it now. Supernatural evil doesn't know it. Had they known it, they never would have done it, is Paul's point. So they are duped. They are led by the nose and duped by Jesus and by the Father to do precisely the thing that was the beginning of the end for them, because there's no going back. The kingdom has been planted, and now it will grow. Jesus says, I have to ascend to the Father. The ascension is actually just as important as the resurrection. Why? Because unless I ascend, the Spirit will not come. And this is why, we could go into all sorts of stuff here, but just as Jesus is identified with the Father, he is God, but he's not the Father and all that stuff. So the Spirit gets talked about in the New Testament as if he's Jesus, but still distinct. You'll have phrases like Spirit of God, Spirit of Christ interchanged in the same verse. Twice, Paul refers to Jesus as the Lord, who is the Spirit. Paul's not denying Trinitarianism. He's just identifying the two, and elsewhere he'll separate them. This is how, again, we talk about Jesus in relation to the Father. The same thing happens with the Spirit in relation to Jesus. How else can Jesus say, behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age? Or, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, there I am in their midst. You have a physical resurrection, and yet in some sense, there's this unity in some way of Jesus and the Spirit. But the Spirit will not come until Jesus ascends. He ascends to be at the right hand of the Father. If you got a kingdom, you got to rule. You've got to be a ruler. The Spirit, again, we'll get into some of this. The Spirit's coming is pretty important, again, for depravity. Let's look at Acts briefly. You have restoring the one family of God and reclaiming the nations. Okay, this is the story of Pentecost. Again, how many sermons have you heard on the story of Pentecost? Both because it's important, and because it's important, you hear it a lot. It's familiar, except for what you're missing. It's like most of the Bible, really. When the day of Pentecost arrived, again, and it's not because we're dumb and they were smart. It's because we don't have the world, we don't have the eyes that they had to catch certain things. When the day of Pentecost arrived, they were all together in one place. And suddenly there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. And divided tongues as of fire, settle on them. Now I have the column here. I have the word divided clicked on, and the column, this is the Greek term diamorizo, okay, to be divided. Whoop-de-doo, okay? Well, if we search for that term in the Septuagint was the Bible of the early church and the New Testament writers. 3/4 of the time they quote the Old Testament, they use the Greek translation of the Old Testament to make their point. Sometimes they quote from the Hebrew and then they do the translation on the fly, but other times they quote from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, because the world speaks Greek. If we search for diamorizo in the Septuagint, it doesn't show up that many times, 19, but one of them, lo and behold, is Deuteronomy 32, where the nations are divided. You say, that might be a coincidence. Okay. Keep reading. Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound the multitude came together, and they were bewildered, because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. If we click on bewildered, we look at the Greek term there, it's sunkeo. If we search for that in the Septuagint, guess where that shows up? Genesis 11, which is the story of the Tower of Babel. We've got 2 terms in the book of Acts, which is about people being enabled to speak in other languages, because the nations have other languages, not just one, that hook us back into the division of the nations at Babel. I would suggest to you that Luke wants us to think of the reversing of the nations here. He wants us to think of Babel, because now all of a sudden the language issue isn't going to matter. God is going to supernaturally, have people speak in these other languages. Why? What is God doing at Pentecost? Well, here's a map. I know you can't really see it that well, but if you could look later in your Bible in the back. This is a map with all of the place names from Acts chapter 2. Again, this is just Acts 2. This is Pentecost. The list, if you read the list in Acts 2, proceeds from east, and the right-hand side here, east to west. It moves in a westerly direction. It starts with the easternmost geographical points and starts moving toward the sea, and then when you hit the sea, it divides up and covers the northern Mediterranean and the southern Mediterranean, all the way through Cyrenaica in Africa, which is almost to Italy, or Rome, but we get Italy in the list as well. You say, well, is that supposed to mean something? Yeah, it is. A number of those names are plucked out of the table of nations in Genesis 10. Others get a new name because we're going from Semitic language to Greek. Okay? The point is that the people in Jerusalem, they're Jews. They're scattered all over the known world. They're scattered among the nations, the 70 nations that are known to the biblical writers. They're Jews. How'd they get there? Exile. They were scattered to the wind because of their idolatry. They were put into the nations that God disinherited and divorced himself from. Why would God do that? Because God plays the long game. God knows that at some point, the Messiah is going to come. He's going to die. He's going to rise again. The event of Pentecost is going to occur where Jews from all of these nations are going to show up in Jerusalem, and they're going to see something pretty spectacular. They're going to see people of their own kin group speaking in the other languages from the regions they're from, and they're going to be telling them the story of this guy from Nazareth who said he was the Messiah, and he was crucified by the Romans, and he rose on the third day. And they're going to believe. 3,000 of them believe. And you know what they do after they believe? They go home. They're like little cell groups planted among the nations. This is why when Paul and other people get to some of these places, there's already believers. It's like a dandelion. God essentially blows the dandelion, and the seed of the kingdom scatters all over the Mediterranean to the nations. The messaging is pretty clear. God is now about the business of reclaiming the nations for himself. If you read through the rest of the book of Acts, again, it's not a coincidence. Remember Acts chapter 1, you shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. Samaria. We have an episode in Acts chapter 8 about Samaria. Why is Samaria interesting? Samaria was the northern kingdom. It was apostate after the kingdom divided. And when the northern kingdom was conquered, the Assyrians in this case came in, they uprooted the populations and deported them to other parts of their empire, and then they took people from other parts of the empire and imported them back into Samaria. And those people would get married and have babies, and you have half-breed Jews, the Samaritans. And the Jews have nothing to do with them because they're not pure. But God is interested in them. The gospel goes to Samaria. And right after the Samaritan episode, this is Philip with the Ethiopian eunuch. Okay, all the way in the south. All the way down to the south, left side of the Dead Sea. There's somebody even from there. Now, this is a little more interesting because we're not told in the Old Testament why Ethiopia would be significant, but we are told in the intertestamental period. There was a long tradition and archaeological evidence, abundant evidence, and textual evidence as well, that a group of Jews left Judah during the time of Manasseh, and possibly earlier, to escape the idolatry there, and they moved down the Nile, and they built a colony at Elephantine. And there were other Jews that settled a little west, again, in these African regions. The gospel needs to go to them too. You see a pattern already. The gospel is being taken to the Jew first, and also then to the barbarian. That actually started with the barbarian, the Greek, because of Acts 2. But while that was, again, theological messaging, the book of Acts proceeds in a more orderly fashion. It wants the Jewish reader to know, well, this is your Messiah too, so let's just do it geographically. We hit Samaria, check that off the list. We've got Ethiopia, check that off the list because there's a Jewish presence there. Philip, after he witnesses to the Ethiopian eunuch, just read it. The Spirit plucks him out of the chariot and deposits him in Azotus. What's Azotus? Azotus is one of the Philistine cities. It is in a region that was not under the dominion of the kingdom of Solomon at its height. The kingdom of Solomon, the kingdom of David missed that one. But the writer of Acts, Luke, wants you to know that that belongs to God. It's actually covenant territory in the original territorial promises. Every place that matters to the Jewish promises to Abraham gets picked up in either Acts 2 or the rest of the book of Acts. Damascus. Paul's headed, this is where Paul has his conversion. Why is Damascus mentioned in the book of Acts? Remember back to the story of Abraham when Lot gets kidnapped and Abraham has to proceed, to rescue him. He pursues, and the Rephaim are in this list in Genesis 14. He pursues this band that captured Lot with 318 men. He rescues Lot. And where do they find Lot? Where do they catch up to them and rescue Lot? Damascus. You remember God had said, every place that your eye can see and the place that on your feet tread on is going to be your land. God didn't forget that. Again, the place names are here for a reason. To the Jewish reader, Luke wants to communicate the gospel was taken to every place that Jews are. And that's important because the Jewish nation needs to be brought back together, all 12 tribes, not just 2. They're still in exile, even in the New Testament period. Only 2 of them ever came back. But God has to heal this rift, and then he's going to use them. He's going to plant them all over the known world. They're going to go back home. Wherever they're at, they're going to get witnessed to, they're going to believe, they're going to be there, because this is now a beachhead for the kingdom of God in the Gentile world. The gospel is seeded in all these places. And you go through the book of Acts, it's to the Jew first, also Greek. This is Paul's pattern as well. And it's conveyed visually. I mean, we could go through, the last Gentile or the last Jew to be converted is the one in Damascus before you get to Cornelius. Cornelius is, again, a God-fearing Gentile. It's a transition point in the book of Acts. All the Jewish stuff has been taken care of. But now we have to get the gospel because Jesus is the Messiah of the nations, not just Israel. And so we get the ministry of Paul. And Paul, we know what Paul does, but one of the cool things about Paul is he has this obsession with Spain. Okay? Romans 15:20. Thus I make it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ has already been named, lest I build on someone else's foundation. But now, since I no longer have any room for work in these regions, I've been everywhere I needed to go, and since I have longed for many years to come to you, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain. Now, he's on a ship, he's in chains. Okay, and he's either writing part of Romans there, or he writes it once he gets into Rome and he hasn't seen them yet because he's in jail. We don't know the exact circumstance, when Romans was written, but he has not seen the believers at Rome yet, so he's writing them. I can't wait to see you guys. Romans 1, I want to impart unto you some spiritual gift, and we got big plans. And it's like, dude, you're in chains. What's going on here? And he actually says to them, I hope to see you in passing as I go to Spain. Paul, you ain't going anywhere. You're manacled to the ship here. Paul is convinced, and he really earnestly wants to go to Spain. And I like to say, what does he like, the food? What's the thing about Spain? Why? Who would care? Why does he have Spain on the brain? It's because he knows Genesis 10. Now, here's our map of Genesis 10, the disinherited nations. Spain, if you know your geography, is right there. And it's Tarshish. You say, well, who cares? Well, let's go back a little bit. The book of Acts covers all of the geographical nations, the geographical regions disinherited by God at Babel, to this line. This is a little bit past Italy, There's only one nation in the entire table of nations that is not covered. It's Tarshish. It's Spain. Paul knows this. Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles. And again, I can't prove it, but I believe that Paul believed he would not die until he reached Spain. That's the outlier. I have been to every place that is under dominion of these other gods that was disinherited at Babel, except for one. My mission is not over until I get to the last one. So there you have it. I mean, why else would he care? Why else would he care about Spain? Because it's Tarshish. He quotes Isaiah 66 as well, which talks about the kingdom, including Tarshish and all this stuff. He knows what he's doing. Here's another thing about Paul. Paul does refer to demons occasionally. 1 Corinthians 10, 21 and 22, he actually quotes Deuteronomy 32, 17 there about avoiding fellowship with demons. But most of Paul's vocabulary are these words, and you're familiar with them if you've read the New Testament. Rulers, principalities, powers, thrones, authorities, all this kind of stuff. What do they all have in common? They are terms used both in the New Testament and outside the New Testament for geographical rulership. In Paul's world, he's not just dealing with demons. Demons are low level. The big players are the ones that control the nations, to whom authority was given as a punishment and who became corrupt. This is those other guys, they're the spirits in prison. We don't really need to worry about them until maybe the day of the Lord. Okay, but the ones we really need to worry about now are the ones who control and have dominion geographically. His vocabulary reflects his worldview. It reflects his theology. Epistles and Revelation. The believer's destiny, and this will be where we end. A couple slides here. I've already mentioned, again, the unusual feature that the language of God's supernatural family, sons of God, holy ones, in the Old Testament, overwhelmingly refer to, again, the supernatural kids that God has. In the New Testament, the words holy ones and sons of God, children of God, never refer to the supernatural beings. They refer to human believers. The language shifts. Again, it's not a coincidence. Believers are the sons and daughters of God. The kingdom is the beginning of this Edenic vision restored. Well, let's just give you a few examples. John 1:12. But as many as believed on him or in him, to them gave he the authority to become the sons of God. It's John 1:12. 1 John 3, behold what manner of love the Father has bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God, the children of God, and that's what we are. Galatians 3:26, if you are Christ's, if you belong to Christ, you are Abraham's seed and heir according to the promise. Doesn't matter if you're Jew or Gentile. If you belong to Christ, you are Abraham's seed. Now, that's a dramatic statement because who else is Abraham's seed? That would be Jesus. Okay, he is the seed. Romans 8:14. The creation groans and travails, waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. It's waiting for the new Eden. Who populates the new Eden? The sons of God. Who are the sons of God? That would be us. Earlier in Romans 8, he refers to anyone who has the Spirit is a child of God, children of God, sons of God. Hebrews 2, I think, is the best passage for this. It's a great New Testament divine counsel passage. For it is fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. This is why he, Jesus, again in the context, is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers, to my siblings. A better way to translate it. Brothers and sisters, siblings. I will tell of your name to my siblings in the midst of the congregation. What congregation? It's the counsel of God. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praise. Do you realize that when you pass on, or again, when either the light of the Lord comes, you will be introduced in the divine council to God, and God will be introduced to you by Jesus. That's the picture. That's Hebrews 2. Again, the language is intentional. Revelation 2, I think, is great. Nevertheless, hold fast to what you have until I come. The one who conquers, the one who overcomes, and who keeps my words until the end, I will give him authority over the nations. Okay, this is Jesus speaking about you. The one who overcomes, I will give him authority over the nations. He will shepherd them with an iron rod. Jesus is quoting a messianic passage, not about himself, but about you. That's just crazy. Like, Jesus, don't you know proper hermeneutics? Like, this is about you. And he said, no, yeah, I get that, but it's about you too. Why? Because we're siblings. He will shepherd them with an iron rod. He will break them in pieces like jars made of clay. As I also have received from my Father, I will give him the morning star. It's an interesting phrase. Morning star language in Revelation 2:28 is messianic. It refers to a divine being who would come from Judah. And we know this from Numbers 24:17. A star will go out from Jacob, and a scepter will rise from Israel. Later in the book of Revelation, Jesus used the same language of himself. I am the root and descendant of David, the bright morning star. Jesus grants his authority to you. Okay, you rule the nations with him. As if that's not enough, we got Revelation 3. Okay, this is we've all seen the picture of Jesus knocking at the door, and that's all we remember of the passage. Okay, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, indeed I will come into him and dine with him. There you go with the cosmic meal. I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me. The one who conquers, I will grant to him to sit down with me on my throne, as I also have conquered and have sat down with my Father on his throne. Okay, if we're going to rule the nations with a rod of iron, if we're going to do, who rules the nations now? The fallen sons of God. Now, Paul, as I said earlier, connects the resurrection of Jesus with the nullification of their power. He does this in 5 or 6 passages, that the resurrection somehow results in the defeat of the rulers, the authorities, the principalities of power, so on and so forth. What that means is, I wish, the audio is terrible, but I got invited to a pagan podcast a couple of years ago. You're going to love this. I get an email from a guy who signed the email as Hercules. When you get an email from Hercules, there's a lot of things that go through your mind. So his show was called The Voice of Olympus. And in the email, he says, look, he goes, I know you're a Christian, I'm a pagan. He goes, but I just read your little book, Supernatural, and I loved it. Will you come on my show? And so I'm like, well, this will be interesting. Why not? So I said, yeah. And again, I've actually been on the show twice now, and I recommend listening to it. I know why you're laughing, and I'll tell them that too, okay? So, I go on this show, and he's excited, and he tells me, he's like, I just can't have this conversation with like anybody else. It's hard for me to find people to talk about this sort of stuff with. And I'm thinking, yeah, I bet it is. So, but again, he's a really, really nice guy, and we just had a good time. But for the first 10 minutes of the show, he's reading me Greco-Roman pagan religious texts with the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. And I'm like, this is awesome. I'm really learning something here. I knew of a few references in Plato, but this guy knows them. And he goes, this is why I was so excited. The Bible has the same worldview as this other stuff. And he says, I have one question. It's a really good interview. I got one question. Because I got one question. If Yahweh, the Most High in the Bible, set this whole thing up, where he divorced the nations and he assigned other gods to them, and then those people are supposed to, not be related to Yahweh, but these other gods, and this is the situation that develops. What does he want? And I'm like, oh, I'm so glad you asked. Because it was a good opportunity, because this is what I felt like Paul for a day, for at least a couple hours. Because Paul goes into a pagan city and he knows that they share the worldview. So he can go into pagan turf and he says, look, fellas, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, look, we worship the gods we worship and you Jews do something else because this is the way the gods want it. The nations are allotted to the gods. And that means, if we forsake our gods, we're in big trouble because they're going to be angry at us because they're the ones that set this thing up. And so Paul would say, well, that's pretty good. We have the same worldview, but there's a little twist on it that you're missing. The Most High, yes, you're correct, set up this system. This is why in the biblical story, everybody knows the true God at one point, and then you get all these pantheons and stuff. So you're right, the Most High sentenced, judged the nations, and allotted these other gods to them. He didn't want them to be worshipped, but that's what happened. We got Psalm 82. We know that's what happened. And yeah, that's the biblical worldview and the biblical story. But the neat thing, and here's what you're missing, the neat thing is that the same Most High became a man, Jesus of Nazareth. And he died on the cross, and he rose from the dead, and now the same Most High is coming to you. The same one that gave these gods their authority in the first place has now taken it back. Their authority is nullified. You don't need to be afraid of these other gods when I tell you that the Most High wants you back in the family. So I actually gave this answer to this guy on the shop. And, I don't know what, at least a seed was planted. He had me back, so he wasn't real mad. But the funny thing was, and I think this is why Stovall's laughing, during the commercial breaks of this show, there's this deep, dark, sinister voice that comes on in between your segments and says, "This is the Pagan Podcast Network. All pagan, all the time." And I thought, not today. So it was fun. But think about the worldview. This is why Paul says, look, when Christ rose from the dead, their dominion ended. They have no legitimate authority over the people they enslave. Now, they're not going away because they want their turf. They want to resist. But greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. This is not just the Pauline message, it's the message of the gospel. So you don't have to feel like you're doing something wrong, like you're violating the Most High's will because he's the one he's the originator of all this because of what happened at Babel. Paul says he not only wants you back, he insists on it. They do not have legitimate authority anymore, just like Satan has no legitimate claim over the soul of any member of the kingdom of God. Christ ascends, the Spirit comes, and that helps us combat depravity. The Messiah is supposed to address all of these problems we talked about in the last hour. And, this is part of our destiny. So the last slide here, I said we would come back to this graphic. If we're here and we have, back here, we have legitimate authority. This is our destiny, to have authority over the nations in the New Eden. Okay, this is the book of Revelation, the end of days, the transition to the age to come. We will, in fact, displace and replace the sons of God who are in rebellion. This is why we're introduced in the council in Hebrews 2, because believers are the reconstituted family and council of God. That's what we are. And Paul, as I alluded to a little earlier, his language becomes decipherable. When you look at the structure, how they conceive the council, the sons of God is the elite tier in the middle. And so Paul in 1 Corinthians 6 says, don't you people know, apparently they didn't, that the holy ones will judge the world. Most of your translations are going to have saints. I really hate that translation, by the way. Holy ones. It's supposed to take your mind back to the supernatural realm, to the divine council, composed of holy ones. And Paul says, don't you know that the holy ones will judge the world? And if the world is to be judged by you, that would mean you're the holy ones. Are you incompetent to try trivial cases? Don't you know that we are to judge angels? We will judge the middle tier in that we will replace it. and we outrank the bottom tier. We are the ones who share the throne. We are the ones who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. Again, all these descriptions. In the end, we have a global Eden with humanity blended into the family of God. You got the two families brought together. Humanity is fit for sacred space. Sacred space covers the entire globe. And the end point is God gets his way. That's why it ends with a global Eden. God gets what he originally wanted. But we've got this whole, epic arc of the history of salvation going on between Eden and this other Eden over here. And there are just things, again, we're wrapping up here, Stovall, there are just things that, again, you'll lose the meaning of certain things if you don't do what you can to, try to pick up the breadcrumbs, of what's going on. We spend a lot of time talking about spiritual warfare, for instance. Spiritual warfare is about the conflict between two kingdoms. We are never told, I think I might have included this. Oh yeah, I did. Let me go to this one slide right here. We are told to, we're never told to go into certain areas and cities and regions and just yell at demons. We're not told to do that. Demons, again, are low-level players. They inflict harm upon individual persons. But intelligent evil that has geographical dominion and is concerned with empires, like in Daniel, it has better things to do than turn people into sock puppets made of flesh. It's got bigger fish to fry. It is about controlling people through, intelligent means. How would you control a population in an empire? You manipulate the humans that are in charge. In that case, they're basically willing idolaters, so it's not really that difficult. But the same thing happens now. Intelligent evil wants to move herds. It wants to control hearts and minds. It's about how you think. It's about big things like, who am I? What's my mission? Idolatry. In other words, being distracted from the worship, from loyalty to the true God to anything else. It's about self-destruction through the things we do or that we don't do. Intelligent evil knows what buttons to push. And you don't have to have a demon behind every rock. You don't have to have, a demon made me do this. No, we can destroy ourselves just fine by ourselves. But to move herds of people in one direction or the other, and toward idolatry and away from the truth, that takes an intelligent plan. And supernatural beings can do this. Again, if I were a supernatural evil being, I know what I would do. I would get to leaders in government and in media. Because if I get a handful of those people dedicated to chaos, that's going to be real effective. I'm not going to work hard, I'm going to work smart. Now, what are we told to do? We are tasked not with, going out and doing, strange rituals and yelling at demons and all this kind of stuff. What are they scared of? I'll tell you what they're scared of. They're scared of the kingdom of God. Because in Romans 11, Paul specifically he's talking about the return of the Messiah. He's talking about the revival of Israel. Okay? And he specifically says, and he says it in Corinthians as well, that essentially the Lord is not going to come back until the fullness of the Gentiles has been brought in. Because then that will initiate the revival of Israel so that all Israel will be saved. Again, it's a debated thing as to what the phrase means, but what I don't want you to lose sight of is the fullness of the Gentiles is key to the day of the Lord and the return of the Lord. Fullness of the Gentiles is the fulfillment of the Great Commission. So what we are tasked with is what Jesus actually told us to do before he ascended. Go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations. See, that's Matthew 28:19, but you know what the verse earlier says to it? All authority is given to me in heaven and on earth. It's not just for the Jew, it's for all the nations. Go therefore and make disciples of every nation. It's the fullness of the Gentiles idea. And I was talking to Stovall last night. I think people, when you talk about this, they get paralyzed by the overwhelming feel of the task. I've left this on the board for a reason. The problem with the fulfillment of the Great Commission, it's not getting done for a number of reasons, but one of them is not math. This is from a Pew survey recently. It actually used census data. As of 2014, there were 25.4% of the US population that called themselves evangelicals. Evangelicals are supposed to know what the gospel is. Now, you can say, well, a lot of evangelicals really don't. Okay, I'll grant you that. Let's cut it in half. Instead of 80 million, that percentage calculates out to 81 million, let's go with 40. The world population at present rate is estimated, right now, 2018 anyway, 7.6 billion. It's supposed to be near 10 billion by 2050. If 40 million people, again, half the evangelical population, evangelizes one person each in 2019, by this time next year, we'll have 80. And then in 2020, we'll have 160. And then we have 320, 640. Now, in only 4 years, we're up over 1 billion. By 2026 or 2027, 23 years early, we cover every last human being on the planet. Look, the problem is not math, but it's very easy to get overwhelmed with the thought of the task. It's not math. So why isn't it getting done? It's not getting done because of other issues. We're fragmented in the church. How are we supposed to illustrate life as God intended it to be in Eden, where everything is unity, there's wholeness? Again, a little slice of what it must be like to live in God's house, in his presence. There's justice, there's wholeness, there's loyalty to the true God, through the gospel. If you listen to me for any amount of time, the gospel is about believing loyalty. Everything we covered today frames what it means to be a believer. I like to use Naaman. I rarely preach sermons, but my first sermon since 2004, I think, was like last year. And I did the Naaman passage, the Naaman the leper, because Naaman and the widow of Zarephath are used by Jesus as two examples of faith. Like, why didn't he pick Abraham? Or somebody famous? Who are these? They're pagans. They're both pagans. Naaman and the widow of Zarephath is from Sidon, Tyre or Sidon. She's Phoenician, okay? Why is he picking these people? Because they both do things that demonstrate they will worship no God other than Yahweh. Naaman says, now I know that Yahweh is the God of all gods, and I will worship no other. Okay, it's belief that this is the true God, he is who he says he is, and that for some reason that I don't quite understand, he loves me. He made a covenant with Israel. I'm allowed to join that if I throw my loyalty over to him and will worship no other. Hey, I got news for you. Naaman's not keeping the Torah. Naaman goes back to Syria. There is no Torah. He's never going to do a festival. He's never going to do Jewish stuff. But he has the one thing that he needs. He knows the one thing that is critical and crucial. And he assigns his loyalty to the true God. And that's his theology. End of story. And again, the widow of Zarephath does the same thing in different actions that she does. Again, what's the point? Well, the point is, believing loyalty is the issue. Now we're asked to believe the gospel. The gospel is that this same God, Yahweh, the Most High, became a man, died on a cross, and rose again for the sins of the world. This is the only means of salvation. John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man, no one comes to the Father except by me. That's what you need to believe. It has nothing to do with your performance. While we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. He didn't die for us while we were cleaning up our act, while we were learning theology, while we were, fill in the blank. Before we had a single thought about, caring about what God thought at all, while we were yet sinners, Paul says, while we were enemies, okay, Christ died for us. So this is the task, and we're supposed to illustrate the message of salvation. We become part of God's family We're supposed to live in a certain way so that the people outside will want to be part of the community. But if we have our own fragmentation, our own issues, if we can't take care of them here, how are we going to restore Jesus' reputation outside? Unfortunately, Jesus has a bad reputation in our culture. And you could say that that's legitimate or illegitimate. It's a caricature, but that's what people are thinking. And they think that way because either something a Christian did to them or, again, made up nonsense about Christians. Okay, the issue isn't solving that. You can solve actually both sides of that by being God's imager. You follow Christ. You imitate him. You are the image of Jesus. You conform to him, and that's the way we image God. Again, all of these things sort of weave together. And again, when we talk about spiritual warfare, when we talk about, I'm rambling on here, I will wrap it up. But when we talk about this kind of stuff, my concern is that we are defeated by math, and we don't need to be, and we're distracted. We're worldly as well. And what I mean by that is we're more oriented by things of this life than of the next. That's a big problem.